Hey folks, welcome to week 13 of DMD100, Intro to Digital Media Design. All right, week 13, we're towards the tail end of the semester. The finish line is in sight. All right, this week is all about typography and letter forms, about how do we read. Now, we are going to spend the week looking at typography from a variety of different angles. We're going to look a little bit at the history of typography. We're going to talk about readability, and we're going to look at some anatomy of type. So specifically, we're going to look at historical classification. We're going to do this in class when we see each other in person this week. So we'll look at these historical classifications, which talk about sort of the historic representations of different types of fonts over time and how some have fallen away and some have persisted over time. We're going to do an exercise called depth perception, which is going to talk about sort of the connection between two-dimensional representation of type and our three-dimensional understanding of the world. And then we're going to look at letter form anatomy. We are going to sort of look at sort of the visual vocabulary of how letter forms are constructed. So we're going to do those in person, so we'll take care of that a little later in the week. For now, you guys are to consume these two videos. The first one is Beginning Graphic Design, all about typography, which is this video here, right, which is pretty great video about typography. It goes over all the basics you could possibly want to know about typography in a very short, like 6-7 minute video. Now listen, typography as an area of study, of course, is something that goes on much longer than 6 or 7 minutes. The truth of the matter is that you can take typography classes and that would last an entire 16 weeks. In fact, if you were pursuing, for example, a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in graphic design at many schools, you would take 2, maybe 3 different typography courses over the course of the time you are in school. You can find thousands of books on typography available on Amazon and a variety of other places. There is so much to learn when it comes to the world of typography. We're spending just 1 week on it, so we're doing a really quick overview just to try to get you to look at letter forms and alphabets and words in a way that maybe you're not used to. We are trained from a young age to simply read and to understand things like phonics and grammar and spelling and those things that speak to our sort of general literacy. But typographic literacy is a little different, and the application of letter forms and alphabets in an artistic and a creative way, well, that's what becomes typography. So we're going to try to understand that a little bit. So consume these 2 videos. Make sure that you watch both of these. We have 10 typography and design tips for beginners, and like I said, this beginning typography video. So check those out. Be sure to consume those, maybe take a few notes, because we are going to talk about those in person this week when we go over these 3 items up here. Now, the main activity this week is our 4th discussion board, which, not coincidentally, is all about typography and literacy. So you have all week to work on this. It has to be turned in by the end of the week. It definitely requires some thought. So certainly consume the consumables first and then dive on into this. So it talks about the 14th century and how at that point 80% of English adults couldn't even spell their names. The literacy rates back in the 14th century were terrible. And then Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, or the movable type machine, as it's sometimes referred to, in 1440, so about halfway through the 1400s. And at that time, only about 30% of European adults were literate. Well, Gutenberg's invention flooded Europe with printed materials, and literacy rates began to rise. Now, the printed materials at the time were oftentimes Bibles or church-related printed materials, posters. But the point is that before that, while printing existed, it existed in a very rarefied form. Earlier types of printing could only produce a handful of copies, whereas Gutenberg's machine allowed for hundreds and hundreds of copies of printed materials. And so, of course, the more things there are to read, well, the more likely it is that people will learn how to read. And so literacy rates went up drastically after the invention of Gutenberg's press. Now, of course, this didn't happen immediately. It certainly took many, many years for this to happen, but it was heading in the right direction. So in the 17th century, education became an emphasized part of urban societies. The idea of being able to learn how to read and write properly really catalyzed the spread of literacy, and this is all on the backs of the printed materials that were now in abundance from Gutenberg's machine. All told, literacy rates in England grew from about 30% of about 4 million people in 1641 to 47%, which was about 4.7 million people in 1696. And while it doesn't seem like a huge jump from 4 million to 4.7 million people, that is a large increase in literacy considering all the other difficulties that people of the time were dealing with. There were wars, depressions, disease, all sorts of crazy stuff going on all the way through to the 18th century, which, struggled against the growth of literacy and the importance of education. People were just trying to survive. But eventually, this literacy growth continued upwards, and then finally, by about 1800, approximately 62% of the English population, about 8 million people, were considered literate. They could read and write at a particular level. And so, over a period of a couple hundred years, Gutenberg's machine really put reading materials and the ability to learn how to read and write into the hands of everyday people. Prior to that, printed materials were very expensive to create, oftentimes done by hand or done in small batches, and so therefore the results of those printings, whether they be Bibles or other types of books, were very expensive, and so not a lot of people could actually afford them. Which is why a lot of times people got information by word of mouth, by sort of public announcement, a lot of other ways that were, not as self-driven. Okay, so the discussion question this week is, so regardless of language or the type of alphabet that is used, literacy is commonly determined by the ability to read words and sentences. Those words and sentences being designed on a page and then printed is at the heart of the practice of typography. Gutenberg's movable type printing press allowed for much larger numbers of printing materials, like we just said, Bibles, books, posters, newspapers, to be made available to the masses. Prior to this, printed materials were far too expensive, like I said, to create, and often one of a kind. If you ever look at illuminated manuscripts, which are sort of illustrated and gold-leafed Bibles from the 14th, 15th century, there's only one of them, one of a type, so it's not like a lot of people had a chance to read them. As such, only those in the upper or ruling classes prior to Gutenberg's machine had access to these reading materials, and thus much of the literacy was centralized in those ruling classes, those upper classes. So for this question, imagine a world where Gutenberg's press was never invented. Pretend Gutenberg never invents the movable type machine. Now, this might require you to go do a little more research on Gutenberg's printing press. Don't just take my word for it. From this particular question, there's lots of good material out there about Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press. So do a little research first, but then imagine that printing press was never invented, and while letter forms and alphabets obviously continued to exist, and they existed before that, they do not become the dominant form of printed communication in our imagination here for the sake of this discussion question. So what other visual elements may have played a key role in mass literacy? How might those elements have been shared with the mass public? Would verbal storytelling take on a larger role? Pantomime, perhaps? Okay, I'm being silly with pantomime, but you get the idea. If the printing press, the type of printing press that Johannes Gutenberg invented, was never invented, how might literacy have spread? Would there be other visual elements that play a role in mass literacy? Would mass literacy have moved at an even slower pace? Would verbal storytelling, the oral tradition, for example, would that have taken a stronger foothold in the development of society? So this is sort of like science fiction speculation we're doing here. We're taking the real history and we're trying to imagine it as an alternate history. And then use your imagination based on what you know about history and communication and all the things we've learned so far about visual literacy, right? All about everything from pictograms to pictographs and so on and so forth. Use your imagination and, of course, your educated brain to imagine what the world would look like from a literacy point of view if Gutenberg hadn't invented his press. Now, of course, in your initial post, respond to the prompt above in a thoughtful, well-researched, and imaginative way. Remember, you're using your imagination, but that is not a substitute for good research. If you don't know much about Gutenberg's press and you don't know about the rise of literacy after the invention of his press, go read about it for a little while before you take the time to respond to this. I want your opinion, but I want your educated opinion. This is essentially an alternate history science fiction research and writing assignment, like I said, so have some fun with it as well. It's about 250 words you have to write. Then, of course, once you've made your initial post, come back a little bit later in the week and respond to at least 2 of your classmates' initial posts, commenting specifically on their presented scenario. Do you think that their scenario is realistic based on what we've learned so far about visual literacy? What other elements of visual literacy may complement or play a role in your classmate's scenario, etc., etc. As always, of course, follow these guidelines for the discussion. So that's your main goal this week, right? So you're going to submerge yourself into some basic typography by watching these 2 videos. When we get together, we're going to go over these 3 areas of typography specifically, and you're going to spend the week working on the discussion board, doing a little research into typography and literacy, Gutenberg's Press, and so on. All right, so it's a big typography week, folks. Get out there and consume some letters. All right, I will see you